May the 10th, 1944. Somewhere on the outskirts of Denton, Nebraska. The sun was just beginning its climb over the cornfields, stretching long, golden fingers of light across the dew-slicked grass. The smell of damp earth mingled with something sweeter, the warm, cloying scent of honey, breathing from the rows of hives lined up neatly by the barn. Arthur Hemlock Bishop, 41 years of age, stood with one hand resting on the rough timber of a hive box, his flannel shirt already sticking to his back in the morning humidity. The bees hummed around him, unbothered, moving with military precision in and out of their waxy cathedrals. In that moment, he looked less like a farmer and more like a silent general commanding a million-winged army. He dipped a spoon into a jar where the honey, thick and amber and glistening, pulled back into the glass in a slow, lazy ribbon. His voice, raspy from years of tobacco and cold Nebraska winters, broke the quiet. "Sweetest thing on God's green earth," he muttered. "Just ain't nothing sweet about this war." Behind him, a distant drone was growing steadily louder. It wasn't the sound of tractors or grain trucks. It was the sound of aircraft. American B-24 Liberators on a training run, banking low over the farm country on their way to England, to Europe, straight into the furnace. Arthur squinted up at them. He didn't wave. He just watched. There was no one to wave to anymore. Not really. His brother Leo had shipped out last winter. The letters had stopped weeks ago. The war felt like another world that had swallowed up all the able-bodied men, leaving farmers like Arthur behind. Surrounded by bees, sweat, and silence, he was reaching for another jar when a low growl tore through the humming. A military truck pulling to a stop on his gravel drive. Olive drab paint. United States Army markings. A soldier hopped out of the cab, clipboard in hand, his accent flat Nebraska sod. "Arthur Bishop?" "That's me," he answered, cautious. "You're on the list. We're requisitioning honey for the 5th Army. Says here you've got 410 hives. That right?" Arthur hesitated. "That's right. But you fellas really need honey." The soldier didn't smile. "Sir, we need everything that doesn't spoil." As the truck backed up to his barn, Arthur felt a strange mix of pride and powerlessness. He wasn't sending guns or bullets, just jars of honey. He muttered, almost to himself, "Nobody's ever won a war with bee spit." But he was wrong. And in just 72 short hours, one of his crackpot ideas, an idea born from this very honey, would help save a convoy of American trucks rolling through occupied France. They called him an eccentric, a nobody, just a farmer, until his honey trick helped turn the tide. For the war, for the farm, and for the bees. Arthur Hemlock Bishop was not a hero in the way most people understood the word. He was a farmer, a beekeeper, and like many men in rural America, he'd never traveled outside his own county. Born in 1903, he'd inherited 180 acres from his father, along with an old barn, a line of tractors in various states of disrepair, and a few dozen beehives tucked under an apple tree. By 1937, he had turned that modest operation into a full-fledged apiary, managing over 200 colonies. That's roughly 14 million bees. He was producing up to 4,000 pounds of honey each season, a figure that made him one of the most productive beekeepers in southeastern Nebraska. But in 1941, the world tilted on its axis. After the attack on the naval base that December, the United States declared war, and everything, every man, every tool, every resource, was suddenly sucked into the vortex of a global conflict. Arthur watched his neighbor's sons, and then his own brother Leo, go off to fight. Some enlisted, others were drafted. Arthur was 38 with a bad knee from a farming accident. He was classified as 3B, unfit for service. That single letter B haunted him. He wanted to fight. Instead, he was told to grow, to produce, to harvest. While other men bled on the beaches of Italy and in the jungles of the Pacific, Arthur was asked to meet government quotas for sugar beets, corn, and soybeans. But in the end, it wasn't his crops that mattered. It was his bees. In the early years of the war, sugar became one of the most heavily rationed commodities in the United States. In 1942, the federal government placed strict limits on sugar consumption, just 30 pounds per person a year, down from over 100 pounds before the war. Sugar was needed for everything from canning food to manufacturing explosives. So civilians, and in turn the military, looked to honey. Honey was shelf-stable, energy-dense, and naturally antimicrobial. It didn't spoil, required no refrigeration, and could be packed into small containers for soldiers on the front lines. The United States Army began seeking out suppliers who could meet this surging demand. Arthur's name appeared on a Department of Agriculture registry in 1942 as a registered honey producer with excess capacity. He received a letter in the mail offering a small government contract. Nothing glamorous. Just deliver 900 pounds of honey to a processing plant in Omaha, Nebraska. From there, it would be canned, stamped Army rations, and sent wherever American boys were fighting. At first, Arthur didn't think much of it. He loaded the jars, signed the papers, and went back to his hives. But unbeknownst to him, something else was happening behind the scenes. The U.S. military wasn't just using honey as food. Quietly, engineers and medics had begun experimenting with it in ways that hadn't been tested on a large scale. They found that honey could be used in field dressings for wounds, thanks to its ability to kill bacteria. It could be used to coat metal to prevent rust. Mixed with beeswax, it could form waterproof seals and even be used to quiet the squeaking hinges of equipment during stealth operations. And back on the farm, Arthur still didn't know. To him, the war remained a distant thing. Letters from Leo grew less frequent. Ration books grew thinner. The sky filled with the roar of passing planes. And the bees kept working. By the end of 1942, Arthur had expanded his operation to 410 hives. That meant more than 25 million bees under his care, producing enough honey to fill a small boxcar. Still, he was convinced he was on the sidelines. He had no idea that his quiet work in the heartland of America was about to collide head-on with one of the most audacious logistical gambles of the Second World War. All it would take was a moment, an idea, and a trick so damn silly no one believed it could possibly work. Early attempts and resistance. By the spring of 1944, Arthur Hemlock Bishop was producing more honey than any other farmer in his county, close to 5,000 pounds. But as the honey flowed from his hives, his frustration thickened with every shipment. The government gave him no feedback, no confirmation, no thank you, no proof it was helping. He'd load the barrels onto the beds of Army trucks driven by faceless men. Just gloved hands, curt signatures, and the sound of an engine disappearing over the hill. Like tossing it into the ocean, he told a friend once. Don't even know if it reaches the boys. His neighbors didn't make it any easier. Still messing with that bee juice, Art? One asked him at church. We're trying to win a war here. Another muttered under his breath. Heard the Army's gonna send you a medal made of honeycomb. Arthur would force a laugh, but the bitterness stayed. He had lost 2 close friends to the draft, and the last letter from his brother was postmarked in December. It was now April. Every night, he sat in the quiet, one hand on his bad knee, and reread that last letter. Leo had written, It's cold, it's wet, and sometimes it's hungry, but we're moving. Always moving. If you send anything, send warmth. That line, send warmth, had burrowed into Arthur's thoughts. He began to look at the honey differently. It wasn't just food. It was dense, slow-burning energy. It was waterproof, sticky, resilient. It could coat, preserve, bind. He remembered his grandfather polishing his boots with a mixture of beeswax and oil. He remembered a neighbor once patching a leak in a Model A radiator with honey. What if honey could do more? One evening, struggling with a sticking hinge on his barn door, he dipped a rag in a mixture of old honey and linseed oil and worked it into the rusty joint. The squeak vanished instantly. The next morning, a truck from the base in Omaha arrived early. Same uniform, same clipboard, but this time the corporal looked exhausted. "We lost 5 trucks in Normandy last night," he said, not realizing he'd let the location slip. "Lost 'em?" Arthur asked. "The noise of the engines, the smell of the oil. Germans heard 'em for miles. Can't sneak up on anyone when your trucks smell like diesel and groan like coffins." Something clicked. Arthur leaned in. "I got something." The corporal stared at him, his expression blank. "I mean, I've got a compound. Made it myself. It quiets squeaks, hides the smell. It's just honey, beeswax, and linseed oil." "You want us to smear army trucks with bee spit?" Arthur didn't flinch. "Might save you 5 trucks next time." The corporal let out a short, harsh laugh. "You serious?" "Dead serious." He expected another jibe, but instead, the corporal went quiet, then said, "All right, 1 crate. I'll take it to the boys at Fort Leavenworth. We'll see what they say." Arthur didn't sleep that night. Days passed, then weeks. No word. He went back to his hives, watching the bees dance in tight spirals over the frames. There was a silent precision to them. No waste, no ego, just function. He thought about how bees coat their hives with propolis to seal gaps, to dampen vibration, to hide their presence from predators. He muttered to himself, "Those little rascals were practicing camouflage long before we ever thought of it." Then, on June the 3rd, a black military sedan pulled into his yard. 2 men got out. One had a medic's insignia on his sleeve. The other was from logistics. No uniforms, just brown raincoats and steel-eyed stares. "We hear you've been mixing something up," the man in the raincoat said. Arthur nodded. "We ran a field test," the second man added, "on 3 trucks. Coated the axles, doors, and exhaust shields with your compound." "And?" Arthur asked, his breath catching. "They ran silent. Smelled like a bakery, but they ran quiet. The Germans didn't hear them until they were over the ridge." The man handed Arthur a piece of paper. "As of now, you are authorized to produce 100 gallons of the compound per month. The code name is Whisper Sweet." Arthur blinked. "I'm sorry?" "Whisper Sweet," the officer repeated. "Welcome to the war, Mr. Bishop." In that moment, the bees outside seemed to hum differently. They sounded like drum beats. He had just crossed an invisible line from farmer to asset. And no one, not even Arthur himself, yet understood just how far his silly idea would go. The silly idea takes root. By the end of May, 1944, Arthur Hemlock Bishop wasn't just shipping honey anymore. He was manufacturing a military compound, barrel by barrel. His workshop, once a quiet storage space for winter hive boxes, had become a crude but relentless production line. Buckets of raw honey stood next to vats of melted beeswax and drums of linseed oil. The air inside was thick and sweet, almost sickening. Every surface had a sticky sheen. Flies beat themselves against the window panes like prisoners. Arthur didn't care. He had orders to fill. Every week, a military truck would arrive from Fort Leavenworth, Kansas, to collect the compound, now labeled WS4, short for Whisper Sweet, Formula 4. There were no other markings on the containers. None of the GIs told Arthur where it was going or how it was being used. But in the second week of June, he got a clue. A letter arrived, not from his brother, but from a Sergeant Frank Miller, 61st Logistics Division, European Theater of Operations. It was handwritten and short. Your stuff works. We treated 5 vehicles last week. The Krauts never heard us coming. Caught 'em by surprise outside Briekbeek. 2 enemy transports destroyed. 0 American losses. Smelled like Christmas. Keep it up. Arthur read the note twice, then folded it carefully and placed it in a glass jar on a shelf, like a medal made of words. Still, he had questions. Would it hold up? Could honey really make a difference? Or was this just a fluke? The kind of story soldiers tell before the real bullets start flying. He started experimenting, mixing new formulas, adjusting the ratios. One morning, while applying a thicker batch to the axle of his old flatbed, he noticed something odd. The waxy coating wasn't just reducing the squeak, it was insulating the wheel from vibration. It didn't just muffle sound, it muffled detection. And in a war where entire truck columns could be spotted from the air by acoustic sensors, vibration mattered. He sent a note back. To whoever reads this. The compound now acts as a vibration dampener on metal surfaces. Try it under hoods, on side doors, on exhaust pipe seams. Repels water, too. A week later, a reply came, this time typewritten. Tested your modifications on 6 Jeeps moving through the hedgerows near Cherbourg. Damping reduced acoustic detection range by nearly 30%. Bravo. Enclosed is authorization to increase production to 300 gallons a month. Prepare for shipment to the port of Southampton for pre-invasion outfitting. Southampton. Invasion. Suddenly, the pieces clicked into place. Arthur knew what was coming. Everyone knew. The Allies were about to punch a hole in Fortress Europe. The only question was when and where. But now, he realized his compound wasn't just for patrols. It was part of something bigger, something massive. On June the 8th, a courier truck arrived with crates and a set of instructions. Prepare 10 barrels for transatlantic shipment. Mark as Class A engineering supplies. Destination classified. No insignia, no ranks, just urgency. That night, as he sealed the last barrel, Arthur paused and looked out at the dark fields. His bees were silent in their hives. There was no wind, no stars, just the low, deep echo of thunder in the west. It wasn't a storm, but something heavier, the kind of sound that settles in your bones. He didn't know it yet, but those barrels would be in Normandy within 10 days. And somewhere on a back road, men would be smearing a farmer's goofy honey compound onto armored doors before driving into the most dangerous stretch of road in the war. What had started as a backyard experiment had just crossed the English Channel. Honey on the front lines. Normandy, June 12, 1944, 6 days after D-Day. In the chaos of the French countryside, columns of American trucks rumbled down cratered roads under the cover of darkness. The hedgerows were thick, the enemy was still dug in, and German ambushes came fast and without warning. But this time, something was different. According to Captain Elias Vance of the 2nd Armored Division, a series of modified trucks slipped silently through an area near Vierville, past what reconnaissance called a kill zone. There was no metallic clatter, no creaking doors, no telltale scent of diesel. We were ghosts, Vance would later write. They were listening for the roar of engines and the rattle of gear. Instead, we gave them silence and molasses. That silence had a name. Whisper Sweet, Formula 4. A sticky, dark coating applied to axles, hinges, and exhaust valves. Field mechanics called it bee grease. The infantry called it ghost syrup. But whatever the nickname, it worked. Back in Nebraska, Arthur Hemlock Bishop had no idea what was happening. He just kept producing, melting, mixing. His hands were blistered from the hot wax. His arms ached from hauling the barrels. But he didn't stop. Then, on June the 25th, a military courier arrived with something unusual, An unmarked yellow envelope containing a photograph. It was black and white, grainy, with deckled edges. But it showed what mattered. An American column of 6 trucks parked safely behind a hedgerow outside Isigny. One soldier was crouched by a wheel, a paintbrush and a can in his hand. On the back, written in pencil, were 4 words: "Your stuff." It worked. This photograph hit Arthur harder than any letter. It meant that his work, his bees, his barn, his sweat, it was no longer just a local effort. It was now welded into the machinery of liberation. By July, the U.S. Army's Logistics Command had authorized the expansion of Whisper Suite to 12 entire engineering units. Over 500 gallons a week were being shipped overseas. British and Canadian forces began requesting the compound for their own night raids in Caen and beyond. And the secret held. The Germans were picking up fewer sounds, fewer mechanical signatures. They chalked it up to the terrain, the wind, the weather. They didn't know that a farmer from Nebraska, a man once disrespected at the feed store, had invented a stealth technology using nothing but the gifts of the earth. Then came the first true test. On the night of August 3rd, Allied intelligence intercepted a German plan to shell a key American supply route near Cherbourg. At least 3 divisions depended on those trucks. If they were hit, entire frontline positions would have to fall back. The decision was made: send a full convoy of 92 trucks, all of them coated in Whisper Suite. The mechanics had just 6 hours to apply the compound. They worked with brushes, mops, even their bare hands. The mixture was thick, pungent, clinging to every joint and seam like sap from a wounded tree. At 2 in the morning, the convoy moved out. No headlights, no engine roars, no squeals, just shadows rolling through the fog. The German spotters didn't hear them. The German mortars didn't fire. And by 6 a.m., the entire supply run was complete with not a single loss. Not one truck hit, not one soldier wounded. The after-action report was brief. Silence provided operational security. Continued use of compound WS-4 in night convoys is recommended. For the first time in the European theater, a logistical miracle had occurred, and no one could explain it. But one man in Nebraska had a pretty good idea, because that same morning he received another package. This one was from his brother Leo. Inside was a worn field jacket, smelling of sweat and diesel, and a note. "Your honey got here before I did." Arthur folded the note, held it to his chest, and sat on the steps of his barn. He could smell the wax and oil in the air, but underneath it all, he could still smell the bees. And they smelled like hope. The little trick in the big battle. August the 19th, 1944. The Falaise Pocket, northern France. For weeks, Allied forces had been pushing German units east across Normandy. But what had started as a breakout was threatening to become a catastrophe, not for the Allies, but for the Germans. Nearly 60,000 Wehrmacht soldiers were trapped between 2 converging Allied armies. If the pocket could be sealed, the German line in France would collapse. If they broke out, the war in Europe would drag on for months. This pocket, a mere 15-mile corridor of shattered farmland and muddy roads, became a battlefield of desperation. The American general, Mark Clark, needed supplies to move faster than the enemy. Fuel, ammo, rations, radios, everything. Enter Convoy, Vagabond 6. 240 trucks, 50 jeeps, and 15 half-tracks, all loaded to the brim and tasked with crossing the Falaise sector under cover of night. Using unpaved farm tracks, bridges barely wider than a tractor, and trails flanked by trees so thick they swallowed the moonlight. At 1900 hours, just before sunset, the motor pool commander gave an order that would have sounded absurd in any other war. "Apply the Bishop compound. Full coverage." 3 dozen mechanics scrambled. Barrels marked WS-4 were rolled out. The honey compound, tacky, heavy, the color of black gold, was brushed onto door hinges, axle joints, hood seals, and tailgate latches. The air smelled of burnt sugar and linseed smoke. In one of those trucks sat Sergeant Leo Bishop of the 1st Armored Division, Arthur's brother. He had no idea the stuff being painted on his truck's engine was made by the same hands that had pulled him out of mud puddles back in Nebraska as a boy. All he knew was what the officer had said. "These trucks don't squeak, they don't stink. You roll quiet, you get there alive." By 22:30, the convoy was ready. The engines turned over with a soft purr. No revving, no clanking of gears, just motion. The darkness was absolute, moonless, overcast, and thick with mist. Headlights were forbidden. Radio silence was maintained. Only the stars, barely visible through the haze, knew the route. As they moved, the convoy passed within 1,000 yards, just over half a mile, of a German mortar position hidden in a hedgerow near Troon. Post-battle intelligence later confirmed the Germans never reacted. Not a single shot, not a single searchlight. They didn't know the Americans were there. But silence wasn't invincibility. 10 miles into the run, as the trucks crossed a makeshift timber bridge over the Dives River, a German reconnaissance patrol spotted movement. A single flare went up, white, then red. And then the firing started. The convoy split. Half the trucks gunned it, pushing forward. The other half veered into a gully below a ridge, trying to flank the attackers. In one of the lead vehicles, Sergeant Leo Bishop was manning a Browning .50 caliber machine gun. He yelled into the radio, "They see us now! Go!" But the surprise had bought them precious seconds. Because those first few minutes of silence had gotten them farther than expected, just far enough to be past the deadliest part of the German kill zone. German shells screamed overhead, but they landed on the tail of the convoy. 4 trucks were hit, 10 men wounded, not a single one killed. The rest, 198 vehicles, made it through. Over 100 tons of ammunition, 5,000 gallons of fuel, and 2 entire field hospitals packed in crates. They arrived in time to reinforce the 1st Canadian Army, which slammed the door on the Falaise pocket the next morning. That night, exhausted soldiers set up the medical tents in silence and reloaded the artillery. Someone lit a cigarette. A medic next to him said, "Careful, this place is a sugar field. You'll go up in flames." They laughed. It was the first time they'd laughed in days. The name, Bishop Compound, began appearing in official reports. Even General Eisenhower made a passing reference to it in a debriefing. Whatever voodoo they're putting on those trucks, keep doing it. But the real moment of truth didn't come from a general. It came in a letter. A week later, back in Nebraska, Arthur Bishop received a battered envelope with foreign stamps. Inside was a piece of canvas from a military tent and a scrawled note. "They used your stuff on our truck. We rolled in quiet, even under fire. I fired back and I made it. Some didn't, but most of us did. Leo." Arthur stood in his kitchen for nearly an hour, staring at the note. He didn't cry. He didn't shout. He just nodded. Then he walked out to his hives, gently opened one, and whispered, "You did good, girls." It was all he could say. The bees kept working, unaware, unconcerned, just doing what they always did. Sealing, protecting, building. Just like Arthur. Just like his compound. A sweet, sticky silence that had walked men through death and into another dawn. Legacy of a quiet war trick. The war didn't end in Normandy. It thundered east across France into Belgium, through the frozen forests of the Ardennes, and finally into the shattered streets of Berlin. But for Arthur Hemlock Bishop, his war, the part of it that was his, ended on a quiet October morning in 1944, when the trucks stopped coming. No letter, no explanation, just silence. The barrels were stacked, The compound was ready, but the army never came back for it. Arthur didn't ask questions. He didn't need to. He understood what it meant. His job was done. By the winter of 1944, Allied forces had broken the German defensive lines. Logistics had changed. New compounds and technologies were being developed in government labs, with budgets 1,000 times bigger than Arthur's. A beekeeper's trick was no longer needed. But that didn't mean it hadn't mattered. In a post-war report from the Army Ordnance Department, buried between statistics on truck tires and motor oil, there is a single line that reads, "Temporary vehicle coating designated WS4 demonstrated a minor but measurable improvement in operational stealth under limited field conditions." Source: Civilian Supplier, Nebraska. No medal, no commendation. Just one sentence in a government document no one would ever read. But that was fine with Arthur. He was never in it for the glory. In the spring of 1945, as victory parades filled American cities with confetti and brass bands, Arthur went back to doing what he had always done. He fixed his tractors. He repainted the barn. He split his hives for the coming clover bloom. And when Leo finally came home, thinner, quieter, a shadow behind his eyes, they said almost nothing about the war. They just sat on the porch, drinking coffee and watching the bees. One day, after a long silence, Leo said, "Heard they tested your stuff on the Navy, too." Arthur grinned. "Hell, maybe I sank a submarine with it." This time, they both laughed for real. The years passed. The compound was never made again. The formula existed only in Arthur's head. A mixture of instinct, trial, and error, and the smell of a Nebraska summer. In 1955, a government inspector visited Arthur's property during a census of agricultural producers. At the end of a long questionnaire, the inspector asked, "Did your operation contribute to the war effort?" Arthur paused. "In a way," he said. "I helped some folks stay alive." The inspector blinked. "You grew food?" "Nope," Arthur said. "I made things harder to hear." The inspector didn't write it down. By the 60s, the barn was starting to sag, and the compound barrels had rusted and gone empty. But the bees were still there, their hum unchanged. Their methods were still perfect. They didn't need a thank you, and neither did Arthur. He passed away in 1974 at the age of 71. His obituary ran 4 lines in the Denton County Chronicle. Arthur H. Bishop, a lifelong farmer and beekeeper, died Sunday at his home. He is survived by his brother Leo. He was known in the county for his honey. Not a word about Normandy. Not a word about the trucks. But on his land, under a rusted gate, a child decades later would find a strange metal box containing a cracked jar. Inside the jar was a folded note, hardened by time. It read, "Whisper sweet, remember us." And maybe that's enough. Because sometimes the smallest contribution in the biggest war doesn't need to be remembered by the world, just by the ones it saved. It's easy to think that history is made by generals and tanks, by grand strategies, famous speeches, and the battles whose names are carved into monuments. But sometimes, it's made by something smaller. A man working alone in a barn, a swarm of bees, a sticky, golden substance that was never meant for war. Arthur Bishop never stormed a beach. He never fired a shot. But his honey, his so-called silly trick, rolled through the mud of Normandy. It crossed bridges under fire. It clung to the axles of trucks, carrying wounded boys home. And it did something that almost nothing else in war ever does. It saved lives without ever taking one. There's something deeply American, deeply human in that idea, that in the midst of the deadliest conflict the world has ever seen, one person, using the most ancient and natural resource on Earth, could tip the scales. Not with violence, but with ingenuity. A jar of honey became a weapon of silence. And for a moment, silence was victory. So maybe it's worth asking, How many other small contributions have we forgotten? How many wars were turned not by bullets, but by ideas? And here's my question to you. What's the most unexpected way you've heard of someone making a difference? Leave your answer in the comments. I read every single one. And if this story surprised you, if it made you think differently about war or what it means to serve, share it. Pass it on. Because sometimes, the sweetest part of history is the part we almost missed.